These are the four pieces of the history of the camp that are summarized in John's book. I'm not going to go through today's presentation sequentially with each one of them. My plan is to basically follow the information as we've learned it since 2006. So we'll be jumping around. Sometimes we'll be talking about the farm, sometimes about the church camp, or the other iterations of the camp. One of the first things to happen after the publication of the book, and many of you who may have been on tours up at Camp Michaux, know it was very difficult to accommodate your way through the camp. There were no trails. Many of the pad sites where buildings had been were completely covered over with invasive species. So one of the first things we did was to get a grant through a new organization that had been formed through state government called the South Mountain Partnership. And we were one of the first recipients of one of their mini grants. And that mini grant's purpose was to, first of all, clear some trails so you could get through the camp. Second, to erect numbered posts at the camp that were keyed to a guidebook that was written initially in 2011, which allowed persons to go through on their own and figure out where things had been at the camp. Up until that time, it was people like me or Vince Montana who would give tours up there, and we would show you the way through the camp as we best understood it. But the guidebook gave us a chance to really, on your own, if you wanted to see the camp at any time during the year. This is a group of the volunteers that first year that we were doing this. This was in April. Can't believe the sun's actually shining in that picture. It rained every single Saturday that we worked all 4 Saturdays that month. We would dig a post hole for one of the posts and it would immediately fill up with water. So that was that effort. At least one of the volunteers from that day is here. I think he's right here. Any other volunteers from that day who are here? They're BG and don't sue anyone else. But at any rate, that was an important initial step. This is what the end result was. This initial map is the 1943 Army map of the site. Any of the numbers in black are the numbers from them. The numbers in the white boxes are the 27 trail markers that we put up to guide you through the site. Clearing of the trails also gave us an opportunity to clear some of the pad sites, one of which was the CCC Education Building. And under a tremendous amount of brush, we found this keystone marker, which was actually a stepping stone up into that building. Throughout the talk today, I'll be throwing in some pictures that aren't necessarily part of this discussion, but it shows some of the new pictures that have emerged. This is one from the church camp. Church camp had 2 Vesper Hills. The original one up behind the farmhouse area, and a second one up behind the main part of the camp. That second Vesper Hill is pictured here. We actually opened access to that site in 2014. Part of the grant that we received from the state allowed us to apply for and fortunately be one of the few. You only get 13 of these approved a year, and the one for the Furnace POW interrogation camp was approved that year and dedicated in July of that year. And that's actually the revised version of the book that's available online or available for purchase at our gift shop over on High Street. Vince Montana, who was here right there, stand up, Vince. Vince Montana was even crazier than I am in terms of Camp Michaux. He actually had started touring up there, I think, before any of this went on. You actually discovered the site as you were out doing some hiking. And this is a photo of him as he didn't know he was going to be here today, so had to put a photo in of him. He would look around the camp, do a little digging, and this was one of the things he found there near the education building, a pen that would have been used as part of the education process at that building. Another one of those added pictures, CCC photo of a working crew as they're heading out to do work on trails or roads or down at the state park. They did a variety of kinds of work. And another picture that was in that same collection that came in. It shows the camp during the CCC era, and this was one of the flags that the CCC used to discuss their, or highlight the kind of work they did. They're often in newspaper articles referred to as the Tree Army, so this flag certainly helps support that. The next big discovery came about the same time, about 2014. I was doing a talk for a group of state employees. I don't even recall anymore what group it was, but after the talk, one of the men who had attended the talk said, you know, I think we have a map of Camp Michaux, and in terms of what it looked like in 1946. So this gave us, you saw that earlier map that showed it to 43, with only a few of the buildings. You find now added more buildings, 2 barracks here, 5 barracks here, and other changes throughout the camp. It shows where the water lines ran, the sewage lines. It also shows this fence that was added in 1945 to separate the camp, to allow Japanese prisoners to use this half of the camp. Now we're back to Vince. Vince, in his research, wanted to learn more about the CCC program. And this article appeared in, I think, 2015, our journal in 2015. He did some digging, found an organization that was tracking surviving CCC campers, and through that effort, found one who had been at Camp Michaux. And his name was Frank Stasky. The name of that group was the CCC Legacy Society. It's a Virginia-based organization that recognizes the efforts of the Chilean Conservation Corps. Frank, who you see pictured here, served in 1940, in the winter of 1940 and the spring of 1941, while he was 17 and then 18 years old. Frank considered the 6 months that he spent at Pine Grove to be some of the best times of his life. He was 92 at the time that Vince interviewed him. He passed away last year. He was at Camp Michaux, the youngest of 8 children, and he indicated that the CCC made a man out of him. The campers were treated like men, and they responded in kind. One of the main projects he worked on was building Piney Mountain Road. That's the road that runs from Pine Grove Furnace over the mountain to Biglerville. At first he worked with crews dragging brush, but graduated to the more elite position of being able to cut down trees. All the work they did was done by hand, including clearing the road. He also indicated they cut brush along existing roads and planted lots of trees. This photo is he had a collection of things that he had from his CCC era, and this is one that he took of an area of the camp. We think it's probably up about where Vesper Hill is, and apparently the CCC program used it as a parking lot. There weren't this many trucks at Camp Michaux, but they did use it as a storage facility. It was one of the early, well actually the earliest camp in Pennsylvania, so it was important that it would be used as sort of a facility for staging and other areas of the CCC program. Frank also talked about social events at the camp, including dances. He mentioned that trash can lids were used as toboggans in the winter. While there, we knew about the education program. He took courses in forestry, wildlife, and history, and was bused into Carlisle for evening classes at the high school 1 day a week. There was also a library at the camp that he used extensively, and the librarian took photos. Actually, this may be a librarian's photo. He spoke very positively about the reserve army officers who ran the camp, and also that the food, served military style, is quite good. You usually don't hear that about military style cooking. However, you have to remember this is the Great Depression. Food, just enough to nourish you, was probably considered good food. Following his discharge at the beginning of the war, he joined the Navy and served there aboard 3 submarines during World War II. He returned with his son in 2013 to explore the camp and used the self-guided book to find his way through the camp. One of Vince's other efforts for us, any of you who've been up there know there's a large concrete marker. You can still read fairly clearly the POW when you look at the marker now. The rest of it's pretty difficult to figure out. So Vince, again, during some of his research, figured out what the original wording was and created this enhanced photo to show what the marker actually originally said. We don't think this was an official state marker, and the reason for that is these dates are wrong. That is what Vince didn't interpret wrong. That's what the dates said. But the camp actually opened in May, and it closed actually in 45, in November of 45. One of the next efforts to begin at the camp was something that I've been looking for during the years that we were doing research on the camp, and that was to find a way to do some actual archaeological work. And Dr. Maria Bruno at Dickinson began using her spring semester class to do some official workings up at Camp Michaux. This is a group of them doing some of their note-taking that is part of the whole archaeological process. I particularly like this picture because Maria and some of the students designed this, and they added a 5th layer. We talked about the farm, the CCC, the POW, and the church camp. They added prehistoric, and that became one of the efforts that they took on as they were doing exploration work at the camp. Actually, I think when I next revise my original talk on Camp Michaux, I'm going to create 5 areas. The prehistoric, which they did find some evidence of, and then really after the church camp closed, after 1972, we have this whole history, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today that went on. So there's really probably 6 areas of history to be talked about here, not just the 4 that we initially focused on. Jim Chiaroka at Dickinson, another person who was out there, did a thorough mapping of the site, GPS mapping, which then Maria's groups could use as they went through the sites. They mark off grids using Jim's maps, and then using compasses and GPS documentation to record everything that they find as they work on the camp. When they actually get to do a dig, after all this mapping part is over, they use a sieve. They mark out a small area to dig, and they dig down through 3 areas, 3 horizons, they call them. Horizon A, which is what's on the surface, Horizon B, the historic area, and then Horizon C when they reach undisturbed soil at the camp. So they dig that, they put it through the sieve and catch whatever is important to preserve, and then everything is put back in the hole, covered over again so that you can't tell that they were ever there. This effort, this actually jumps way ahead, this is 2018, but that effort that Maria's group has been doing resulted in an article in Pennsylvania Archaeology. A copy of that magazine is on the table at the back, and using the items that they found, they wrote an article about what the items they found tell them about the camp. They just found 120 items during the course of the time they were preparing for this article, and based on an assessment of what pearlware is and what redware is and what whiteware is, they determined what they thought the life would have been like at the farmhouse. These digs were actually done adjacent to the farmhouse. In 2014, we, as part of our work that summer, there wasn't a lot of restoration work needed to keep the trails in good effort. Every year we go back and make sure everything's in good order. So that year we expanded 3 additional sites. One to that area that I mentioned that was a Vesper area for the camp. And then this area we knew about, but you really couldn't get to it. But it's where the water tanks were. Water was originally held in a reservoir down in the main part of the camp, on the west end of the camp. It was then piped into a pump house area and then pumped up onto the side of the mountain in these 3 large water tanks that were held within this building, which now you can see that the roof has collapsed. And then the water was fed back into the camp by gravity. Another picture that I've just thrown in for the fun of it. Another CCC group of workers, this one dated to 1935. The next event occurs in, looking for my date here, 2014. We were, actually Kara was contacted by a woman from California who she indicated her father had actually been one of those 161 Japanese prisoners at the camp. And she came, met with me, met with Kara, and shared the information she knew about the camp, which included her father's memoirs. We published those memoirs in the 2015 journal. He was interrogated at Camp Michaux for a brief time and gave insight into what his war experience was like. My war, done by Yoshikuni Masayama, told about his entire war experience. We just published the part that dealt with his experiences here in this country. From my reading of what Japanese soldiers were like, I don't think he was your typical Japanese prisoner. He'd been a civil engineer before the war, in college education. He had a family, and when the war began, he didn't immediately join. He wasn't drafted by the Japanese until 1944. He was stationed on Iwo Jima at the time of the American invasion and had been instructed by his officers to fight to the death. He was not an officer. He chose not to be an officer, even though he had a college education. As the invasion continued, many Japanese soldiers became ill and ill-fed and were unable to fight to the death as they had been instructed to do. Yoshikuni was one of them. He hid in a cave until discovered by Americans on April 8th, 1945. He weighed 85 pounds. He felt extremely dishonored by being captured. He recuperated in a hospital in Hawaii and became aware of how different the Americans were from the Japanese propaganda that had been painted during his time in Japan and during the war. He learned English, read as many English language books as he could, and then was transferred to the U.S. mainland, initially San Francisco. He remembers seeing Chicago from the train on his trip across country, and at Pittsburgh was offloaded onto a bus and hauled to a remote location, Pine Grove. There were separate barracks for officers and 4 for the men. There was a dining hall and a shower facility and a bathroom. He used the nickname Yama so that his English or his American guards could better accommodate him, and became an informal interpreter using his developing understanding of the English language. He and 12 other prisoners were in charge of the cooking for the Japanese. He also made contact with some of the German prisoners. The officers at the camp made life difficult, the officers, that being the Japanese officers, made life difficult for the prisoners who appeared to be cooperative. being older, he felt free to resist their efforts and to remind them that they were also prisoners of war. He was at Pine Grove from August 8th to September 10th, then moved on to Fort Meade, where he indicated life was much more restrictive than it had been at Pine Grove. From there, he went to Fort Eustis in Virginia, and finally returned to Japan on his 40th birthday on January 7th, 1946. His family had been reported at Iwo that he had died, so he had a difficult time reconnecting with them and convincing them that he was in fact alive. He lived until 1962. Two of his children settled in the United States, and many of his grandchildren are now American citizens. They credit their father's positive attitudes about America for them making this change in their lives. So Mayuki, who we met, is actually an American citizen, and she's married to an American. This is the transfer order that brought the 161 prisoners to Camp Michaux, or what we now call Camp Michaux. It's another one of the photos that turned up recently. I wish we had the oil painting that it's a photo of. Beautiful picture. I think it's much stylized. I can't picture any place on Camp Michaux that looks quite like this, quite so attractive. The two exceptions to that would be the guard tower on the right. That's what they look like. And the white painted rocks. They were everywhere. Our next information about Camp Michaux, again, goes back to Vince. And this article by him appeared in this year's journal. Vince, as usual, went the extra mile to dig. And in his digging, he discovered that an article had been written by Diane Reed back in 1983 in work that she was doing at Dickinson, and indicated that at least one of the prisoners, a man named Chestulik, had a collection that he had made while he was at the camp. So Vince's idea was, well, I need to find out where that collection is. And he did. Back in 1983, Chestulik was not willing to share the information. It had been drummed into the guards at the camp that this was a secret camp. You couldn't talk about it. We had the same experience a few years ago when we were interrogating, or we were questioning some of the original interrogators at the camp. They had the same idea. We can't talk about this. They finally were convinced that in fact they could talk about it. Those secret documents had been declassified and could now be talked about. So this is Robert Chestulik. He enlisted in the Army in 1942. He suffered serious injuries in Normandy and recuperated in a hospital in England. He expected to be discharged when he returned to the United States, but instead was transferred to this secret POW camp at Pine Grove Furnace. He was not happy about the assignment, but eventually came to accept his new assignment, guarding German and eventually Japanese prisoners. He became particularly close to the 8 or 9 German prisoners who were assigned to the camp permanently. This is a picture we had in our collection, but we didn't know who it was. We now know. In Vince's inveterate researching to find out if did the collection still existed, he found 2 of Robert's daughters. Robert was actually from Chambersburg, so he had a close connection to this area. And they made his collection available for viewing. This is just a small piece of it because I didn't realize that the collection actually would be here today. So that's what you see on the tables at the back. Extensive photos of the collection are shown in that journal article, and these, as I said, are a few of the ones that I selected for sharing here. We have 4 members of the family here today. Dana, Stan, Dana Swandle, Judith Schatzer. Those are his daughters, and 2 of his granddaughters, Mindy Dean, she's back here, and Christy Swanger. And here's Christy. So thank you for being here today. Hart?
His name was Chastity. Pronounced Chastity.
One of Vince's finds during his work at camp, and this is another one of those things that was buried, was this concrete structure. It obviously had been dragged from wherever it was originally, and it says Jan's Bridge on it. And again, Vince thought, well, I've got to figure out who this is. And in dealing with some research that he did on the guards at the camp, particularly as it related to Chastular.
Yes.
Chastular, thank you. He discovered there was a man named Yance who was on that list. Yutz. At any rate, this was Private First Class Louis Paul Yutz. He was a native of Lebanon County, which is where Vince lives, and discovered that Yutz's daughter, Helen, lived around the corner from him. So just an amazing discovery. The rocking horse at the back of the display area was made by Alois Hannes, and I have no idea how you pronounce that. So. And it was made for Helen. In addition to that, another German prisoner, we don't know his name, from a photograph that Louis had, painted the oil painting. So there's a blow-up of the photograph back there and the actual oil painting that Helen allowed Vince to bring here today. And there is, again, didn't know it was going to be here, so there's a close-up of it. And the oil painting. Another one of the added photos that was discovered in recent years, this of the mess hall, the dining hall. It's a church camp picture, so it is listed as a dining hall. In that same journal, the article that Vince gave us, there was another article by John Bland, the same John Bland that did the Secret War at Home book. John was always, and I remember this from when he was an intern here at the Society, was always particularly interested in the submariners. Really wanted to know more about them. And so somehow from his home in Georgia, he has tracked down information about 3 of the German prisoners who were at Camp Michaux. I will add that in 2013, when John left the area, he had analyzed the transportation records at the camp that he had found at the National Archives, and had identified 3,500 German prisoners that had been processed through the camp. But he was only halfway through those records, and so he left them with me to complete the documentation. And from that, we now know that more than 7,500 German prisoners were processed through the camp, in addition to the 161 Japanese. His article then focuses on these 3 German prisoners, the first of which came from a U-boat that was captured off the coast of Algeria, the U-595. And this is the transfer records for some of those submariners to be transferred to Pine Grove. This included Seaman Second Class Gerd Horn and Fireman Third Class Werner Rost, who were taken to Pine Grove after their capture. Military intelligence did not notify the families that these men had survived. They did not want the Germans to know that this submarine that had a lot of advanced technology on it had been captured. So the families were not notified until after the interrogations were completed. Horn and Rast were able to supply important information about the weapons technology on the U-595. Horn was from Barmen, Germany, about 35 kilometers east of Dusseldorf, where he lived with his parents and one sister. Rast was from Ragun, Germany, about 135 kilometers southwest of Berlin. He lived there with his parents, one brother, and two sisters. From the pair, they learned about active sonar countermeasure devices they called pill throwers, and radar and sonar signature reduction coatings on their U-boat. And that's a picture of the U-boat prisoners that came to Pine Grove. This is Horn's interrogation report in German, though we do know what it said in English. Moving on to the second submarine that John focused on, the U-118. Now this boat was sunk. This is actually when it was being fired on, and a number of prisoners were captured from it. One of which was radio man Rudolf Weimer, sent to Pine Grove for interrogation. This is some of the U-118 prisoners. His knowledge as a radio operator was of particular interest. He knew information about sending and receiving messages and the use of the Enigma machine to code and decode messages. He was very talkative during interrogation and also relayed that many men from the Navy were being sent to Russia, which was a great fear of the German military. The Eastern Front, you hear that in movies all the time. They don't want to be sent to the Eastern Front. So actually being a prisoner was not considered to be quite such an awful thing as it was by the Japanese. This is a summary of some of the interrogation reports that were done. It's actually just half of them, but it's interesting that both Gerd and Werner are on the list. Notice this column, all the no's, but for Gerd and Werner, it was a yes. So it means that they were cooperative, they were getting important information from them. Another one of the photos that's taken up recently, building that the church camp called Calvin. I'm pretty sure I know exactly which building this is. I think it's numbered 16 on the walking tour, and I think that's true because of the foundations that are there. Most of the foundations were temporary foundations for these buildings. This was an exception, and so you can still see those today. One of the most exciting things for me personally that has happened in the last 15 years is this postcard. At this year's workday at Camp Michaux, after we had completed our work, clearing trails, clearing pad sites, a man who I had never met before, is not affiliated with the society at all, but found something on the website that this works day was going to be going on. He showed up, and after the workday, walked up to me and said, "I'm sure you already have a bunch of these," which we did not. He had this photograph, this postcard in his collection. And for the first time, we learned a whole lot about what the farm was like. You can see the extent of the cleared land. You can see the entire barn and the entire farmhouse. The farmhouse in particular was interesting because all we knew about was this part of it. This is all that was there during the CCC era and the POW era, and the church camp era for that matter. This two-story piece we had no idea was there. So it'll give us a different area to focus on when we do archaeology in the future. And the other big thing that we learned, this is the barn wall that we knew about. Now we know there were actually two stone walls, not just one. This is the wall that we knew about. Most of this top part had already fallen off. And apparently another stone building as well. So greatly expanded our information. And then with the date of 1913, we know that the fire that took the barn had to have happened before then. This is what the barn looks like now. In February of 2015, we knew it had to happen soon, no doubt. It was bulging. The Michaux State Forest people that put fencing around it to keep people away from it, and then on February 2nd, it did collapse. Another one of the photos that we became aware of recently is this ammunition box. Apparently, though the military had cleared out the camp before the church camp took over, there were some things that remained, and our understanding is that these ammunition boxes, at least some of them, were used as the support benches for Vesper Hill. Another really unusual event occurred this past year. We again got one of those mysterious phone calls like we got from Mayuki Hegg from a woman in Virginia. She said, "We think we have a CCC uniform from your camp." She, again, was a very good researcher. She must have taken training from Vince. She took this little bit of information here that appears on his hat, did some CCC research, and found out that Company 329 was the Pine Grove camp. Excuse me. Did some research, found out that the man who had owned this uniform that was found in their attic in Virginia was Lloyd Baker, born in 1923, and eventually in Missouri, but eventually somehow ended up in Virginia. That part of the information we haven't tracked down. He served 2 terms in the CCC, 1 term in Missouri and 1 term in Pennsylvania. And the family, Lloyd Baker's family, was not interested in having the uniform back, so they gave permission for it to come here. And it's on exhibit on the table to the left at the back. That brings us up pretty close to the present day. There's a project that got started in 2018 that I'll show you some pictures of here in a moment. We were notified in 2015 that the state's effort to restore normal flow to streams that had been dammed up during the 18th and 19th century had allowed Tom's Run to come to the top of the list, and that Tom's Run would now need to be restored to its original flow. This is what Tom's Run looked like in 1950, or the dam, the water behind the dam. This is what it looked like in early 2018. And this is what it looks like now. The positive side of this whole effort, a couple of them actually, was that the state folk were willing to listen to the history folk and do what they could to preserve what had been there. So instead of taking out the dam and totally restoring it to its original flow, they allowed the flow to go around the dam. So the dam is still there. This is up at the other end where the diversion channels were. The diversion channels were taken out, but the one that allowed water to flow into the pond, into the swimming area, was maintained. So this is what Tom's Run looks like through that same area now. Another piece of the project, also toward the history side of things, provided for the camp to be sprayed so that the invasive species, and they're really particularly the barberry, are just awful. And they allow the area to be sprayed so that now, in some ways the camp's not as attractive as it was, it's not as green as it was. There's a lot of dead vegetation at the camp. At about the same time, the Michaux State Forest had also hoped to do some restoration work, particularly after we got that view of what the farm looked like. And they got money that they didn't expect to get and allowed them to spray the entire 200 acres. So all of the Camp Michaux area has now been sprayed, and the farm area, going well below, beyond what the Michaux did. This is called a royer, And this is a large piece of equipment that dragged the sprayer through the 200 acres and allowed the vegetation to be reduced. It was supposed to come back in November and December and then January. And guess why they couldn't come back? The rain. The rain has delayed much of what should already be finished. That original grant that restored Tom's Run provided for 2 historical markers. They have been made, but they have not been able to be put in place. An additional grant was also given to the Historical Society for a 3rd historical marker. That one will talk about the history of the barn and the farm. That one we haven't even been able to have made yet because we're not quite sure what we want to put on it until all of this work has been completed. So this is what though this is a winter picture, this is what the vegetation looks like. It's brown. And that brings me to the conclusion of today's talk, and that's the other dam on Tom's Run, the one that holds back the water for the drinking water for the field. We are hoping that as we move forward with this, that in fact this will also be preserved and that will allow Tom's Run to go around it. But those plans have not been fully developed yet. But they were sensitive to the historians' need to preserve what we can preserve. This is actually more important historically because this goes back to the CCC where the lower dam is a church camp construction. So that's where we are in February of 2019. Hopefully they will be coming in with the lawyer and go through and remove all the dead vegetation so that the plan is for natural vegetation to be replanted there, what have been there possibly even before the farm. So that's where we are today. And I'd be glad to entertain any questions, and I'm sure Vince and the Chashulik family would be glad to do the same. Thank you very much.